Every picture holds a story. Welcome to Hidden Stories. On February 19, 1942, air raid sirens suddenly sounded across Darwin. Japanese carrier aircraft crossed the coastline and descended toward the northern port. Bombs struck ships, warehouses, airfields, oil tanks, and military installations. Black smoke soon covered the harbor and much of the surrounding city. For many Australians, the distant global war had reached their homeland. Yet another struggle was unfolding beyond the aircraft, bombs, and burning ships. This second battlefield had no tanks, soldiers, or visible artillery positions. It lay silently beneath thousands of kilometers of dark ocean water. Its most important weapons were cables resting across the ocean floor. These cables did not transport soldiers, ammunition, aircraft, or military supplies. Instead, they carried orders, intelligence, diplomatic messages, and strategic decisions. In a global war, information could become as valuable as weapons. But to understand why cables mattered during 1942, we must travel backward. We must first understand how isolated Australia once truly was. Today, information can travel from Australia to Europe within several seconds. During the 19th century, the same journey could require several months. Letters from Sydney or Melbourne first had to board ocean-going ships. The ships crossed the Indian Ocean and continued through the Red Sea. From there, the messages traveled onward toward Britain and continental Europe. By the time an important document arrived, circumstances could have completely changed. Prices could rise, governments could change, and wars could already begin. For ordinary families, the delay created frustration and uncertainty. For governments, merchants, and military commanders, it created serious danger. London could not quickly understand what was happening across Australia. Australia could not receive urgent instructions from Britain in time. Geographically, Australia belonged to a vast worldwide empire. Communicationally, however, it remained a distant and isolated outpost. Ships alone could not solve this problem of distance. Australia needed information to travel faster than any ship. That requirement led directly to one of the 19th century's greatest inventions. It led to the electrical telegraph. The electrical telegraph transformed communication during the 19th century. Its basic principle was simple, although its impact was revolutionary. Electric signals traveled along metal wires between distant telegraph stations. Operators converted those signals into letters, words, and complete messages. For the first time, information escaped the speed of physical transportation. Messages no longer depended entirely upon horses, trains, or ships. Telegraph lines soon connected cities across Europe and North America. However, land-based success revealed one enormous remaining obstacle. The oceans still separated continents from one another. An ordinary wire could not simply be dropped into seawater. Seawater disrupted electrical signals and rapidly damaged exposed metal conductors. Waves, currents, pressure, and rough seabeds created additional engineering problems. Engineers therefore surrounded copper conductors with thick layers of insulation. They then added metal armor to protect cables from physical damage. These innovations produced the first practical submarine telegraph cables. In 1866, a reliable transatlantic telegraph cable entered regular operation. Information could now cross an ocean far faster than any steamship. The world had not physically become smaller, but the time required to cross distance had suddenly collapsed. Once Europe and North America were connected, another question naturally emerged. Could the same technology finally connect distant Australia? Australia's international communications breakthrough arrived during the early 1870s. A submarine telegraph cable extended southward from Java toward northern Australia. The cable reached the coast near the remote settlement of Darwin, but a cable landing in Darwin could not serve the entire continent alone. Australia also needed a land route connecting Darwin with southern cities. Engineers began constructing the Australian Overland Telegraph Line. The route stretched northward from Adelaide across the dry continental interior. Workers faced extreme heat, floods, water shortages, disease, and isolation. Equipment and supplies traveled across enormous distances with limited transport. When the overland line finally connected with the submarine cable, everything changed. Australia became connected to the international telegraph network. Messages that once required months could now arrive within hours. News reached Australian newspapers while events were still relatively recent. Merchants obtained overseas prices before market conditions had completely changed. Government officials could exchange information with Britain far more rapidly. Darwin was no longer merely a remote northern settlement. It became Australia's first major international communication communications gateway. This new connection solved the problem of distance. However, it also created a new form of dependence. Once governments relied upon cables, protecting those cables became essential. Britain did not build submarine cables only for private conversations. By the late 19th century, the British Empire stretched across the world. London needed contact with Canada, India, Africa, Asia, and Australasia. Managing such an empire depended upon the rapid movement of information. Orders had to travel outward from the imperial government. Reports and intelligence had to travel back toward London. Naval commanders needed information about ships, supplies, and possible enemies. Merchants needed current information about prices and international demand. Submarine cables gradually became the empire's global nervous system, but Britain soon recognized a major strategic weakness. A cable was only useful while its route remained secure. If a route crossed hostile territory, an enemy could interrupt it. Foreign-controlled stations might also monitor or delay British messages. Britain therefore preferred routes passing through British-controlled territories. This strategic thinking shaped a global imperial cable network. Australia became an important junction between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. The cables looked like peaceful commercial infrastructure, yet they were quietly becoming instruments of imperial power, and once cables became instruments of power, they also became military targets. The strategic value of submarine cables became undeniable during wartime. A country could use cables to command fleets and overseas forces. It could also communicate with colonies, allies, and diplomatic missions. Therefore, destroying cables could weaken an enemy's entire communications system. Deep ocean cables were difficult to find and reach. However, shallow water sections near coastlines were much more vulnerable. Specialized ships could drag grappling hooks across the seabed. Once a cable was found, crews could lift and cut it. During the First World War, Britain cut several German international cables. Germany then relied more heavily upon long-distance wireless radio. That change created a second strategic consequence. Radio signals traveled through open space and could be intercepted. British listening stations could receive and analyze German transmissions. Cutting cables therefore did more than interrupt messages. It forced the enemy toward a more exposed communication system. By the Second World War, every major power understood this lesson. Communications infrastructure had become part of the battlefield itself. This was the strategic world Australia entered in December 1941. In December 1941, the Pacific War expanded with extraordinary speed. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and advanced across Southeast Asia. Hong Kong, Malaya, and the Philippines came under immediate attack. Japanese forces moved toward the resource-rich Dutch East Indies. On February 15, 1942, Singapore surrendered. The event shattered one of Australia's central defense assumptions. Australia had long expected British power in Singapore to provide protection. Now that protection had disappeared almost overnight. Japanese forces stood much closer to Australia's northern coastline. Darwin suddenly became a frontline military and logistical center. Ships carried troops, fuel, equipment, and supplies through the harbor. Aircraft used nearby airfields to support regional military operations. This transformation made Darwin strategically valuable. It also made Darwin an obvious target. Only 4 days after Singapore surrendered, the attack came. On February 19, 1942, Japanese aircraft approached Darwin from the sea. Shortly before 10 o'clock, the first attack began. The attacking force included fighters, level bombers, and dive bombers. They targeted ships, docks, warehouses, airfields, and military facilities. The first wave involved approximately 188 Japanese aircraft. Explosions tore through Darwin Harbor and surrounding areas. Ships were sunk or damaged, and buildings caught fire. Approximately 2 hours later, a second attack began. Another 54 bombers concentrated upon Darwin's military airfield. The raids caused extensive destruction and severe confusion. They became the largest single foreign attack on Australian territory. Japanese aircraft later returned to attack Darwin and other northern locations. The raids demonstrated that northern Australia was no longer safely distant. But the bombing also revealed another vulnerability. Ports and airfields were not the only systems that could fail. Communication itself could also be attacked or interrupted. A communications network depended upon many physical locations. Telegraph offices, power stations, radio towers, and cable stations were essential. Bombs could destroy equipment or cut important land connections. Sabotage, accidents, and power failures could create further disruption. Even if a deep-sea cable survived, its coastal station might not. Australia's early northern cable route faced an additional strategic problem. It depended upon stations located throughout Southeast Asia. As Japanese forces occupied those territories, the route became unreliable. Therefore, Australia could not rely upon one cable or one direction. Its survival depended upon alternative routes and communication technologies. This is a crucial point often lost in dramatic storytelling. There was no single magical cable that permanently saved Australia. Instead, Australia relied upon a network with several possible paths. When one route failed, messages needed to move through another. Fortunately, another major route had already been constructed. That route crossed the Pacific rather than Southeast Asia. During the early 20th century, a major Pacific cable system began operating. It linked Australia with New Zealand and several Pacific islands. The route then continued northeastward toward Canada. From Canada, messages could travel across North America and the Atlantic. Eventually, they could reach Britain without depending entirely upon Southeast Asia. This system became associated with the so-called all-red route. British possessions were traditionally colored red on imperial maps. The route therefore aimed to use British-controlled territories whenever possible. Constructing such a long cable was extremely expensive. Its commercial profits alone could not fully explain the project. Its deeper value was strategic security and redundancy. If the northern route failed, the Pacific route offered another option. This did not make Australia invulnerable, but it made complete isolation far more difficult. Yet cables alone could not serve every wartime communication need. Ships, aircraft, and mobile forces required another technology. That technology was wireless radio. Wireless radio offered something submarine cables could never provide. It allowed communication without a permanent physical connection. Ships could exchange messages while crossing the ocean. Aircraft could receive instructions while flying between military bases. Mobile units could communicate while changing position. However, this flexibility came with an important weakness. Radio signals traveled outward through the air. Enemy listening stations could receive those signals from great distances. Encryption protected the content, but not every communication pattern. Analysts could examine timing, frequencies, locations, and signal strength. Those patterns sometimes revealed military movements and command structures. Cable signals remained inside physical conductors and were harder to intercept. But cables only connected fixed locations. Radio provided mobility, while cables provided stability and discretion. Therefore, the two technologies were not true rivals. They were complementary parts of the same wartime network. Together, they allowed information to move from governments to headquarters. From headquarters, radio carried instructions toward moving units. This combined system explains how information became military power. A submarine cable could not shoot down an enemy aircraft. It could not sink a warship or stop an invasion force. Its military value came from what happened after information arrived. A supply ship needed instructions about which port remained safe. Air commanders needed warnings about approaching enemy aircraft. Military planners needed weather reports before launching operations. Governments needed accurate numbers for fuel, weapons, and available troops. One delayed message could send supplies toward the wrong destination. One misunderstood order could expose soldiers to unnecessary danger. Without communication, commanders had to act using incomplete knowledge. Cables shortened the time between information, decision, and action. They connected political leaders, military headquarters, and logistical centers. This was especially important after Australia's strategic situation changed. Britain could no longer provide all the protection Australia required. Australia now needed closer coordination with another major ally. That ally was the United States. The fall of Singapore forced Australia to reconsider its defense strategy. Britain remained a close political and military ally. However, Britain was fighting across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. It could not rapidly concentrate sufficient power in the Southwest Pacific. Australia increasingly depended upon American ships, aircraft, troops, and supplies. In 1942, a new Allied command system emerged in the region. General Douglas MacArthur established his headquarters in Australia. Australian cities became major bases for planning and logistics. American personnel and equipment arrived in rapidly increasing numbers. This alliance required continuous exchanges of information. Transport schedules had to match military plans. Intelligence reports had to reach the correct headquarters. Fuel, aircraft parts, food, and medical supplies required coordination. Communication networks therefore supported Australia's strategic transformation. Australia moved from imperial dependence toward closer American partnership. But building a network was only half the challenge. The other half was protecting and repairing it. The deepest sections of submarine cables were difficult to attack. Ordinary ships could not easily locate cables thousands of meters underwater. The greatest danger existed closer to the shoreline. Shallow water cables could be damaged by anchors or specialized equipment. Landing stations could be bombed, occupied, or sabotaged. Landlines connecting stations with inland cities could also fail. Natural forces created additional risks. Earthquakes, seabed movement, storms, and fishing equipment damaged cables. Therefore, protecting communications required more than military guards. Authorities needed spare equipment and trained technical workers. They also needed maps, testing instruments, and alternative routes. Specialized cable ships played a particularly important role. When a fault appeared, engineers first estimated its location. A ship then lowered grappling equipment toward the seabed. Crews lifted the damaged cable onto the deck. Engineers removed the broken section and reconnected the line. This work required patience, skill, and considerable physical danger. Behind every functioning cable stood many largely forgotten workers. War stories usually focus upon pilots, soldiers, admirals, and generals. Communication workers rarely occupy the center of historical narratives. Telegraph operators converted written messages into electrical signals. Other operators carefully recorded every incoming word and number. Cipher specialists encrypted messages before transmission. They also decoded incoming orders and intelligence reports. Radio operators listened through static for weak distance signals. Line workers repaired damaged poles and wires across remote regions. Cable engineers understood electricity, materials, ships, and ocean conditions. A single mistake could change the meaning of an entire message. A delay could cause aircraft, ships, or supplies to arrive too late. Much of this work remained repetitive, exhausting, and completely secret. Many workers could not discuss their duties after the war. Yet without them, cables and radio equipment were merely silent machines. Their work kept Australia connected throughout a period of extreme danger. When the war ended, their communication system did not disappear. Instead, it became the foundation for a new communications age. The Second World War ended in 1945. International communication demand continued growing rather than declining. Early submarine cables carried relatively small quantities of telegraph traffic. Governments and companies wanted to transmit more information more quickly. Engineers developed improved cables capable of carrying telephone conversations. Coaxial cable technology significantly increased available transmission capacity. Underwater repeaters strengthened signals across enormous ocean distances. International telephone networks gradually connected continents more closely. During the late 20th century, fiber optics created another revolution. Electrical pulses in copper were replaced by light inside glass fibers. A single fiber optic cable could carry enormous volumes of information. Telephone calls, television signals, and digital data crossed the oceans. The technology changed, but the original purpose remained unchanged. Human societies still needed information to cross oceans quickly and reliably. This history leads directly from wartime cables to today's internet. Many people imagine that international internet traffic travels mainly through satellites. Satellites certainly support navigation, broadcasting, and remote communications. However, most international digital traffic travels through submarine fiber optic cables. The reasons are capacity, speed, reliability, and relatively low latency. When Australians open overseas websites, their data may cross the seabed. International video calls also depend heavily upon submarine cables. Cloud services, financial markets, universities, and governments use these networks. The modern digital economy, therefore, has a physical foundation. That foundation consists partly of cables lying beneath the ocean. Modern cables still face many familiar dangers. Anchors, fishing equipment, earthquakes, and sabotage can cause serious disruption. Landing stations remain strategically important and potentially vulnerable. The technologies are more advanced than those used in 1942. But the underlying strategic problem remains remarkably similar. A connected country can coordinate, respond, trade, and communicate. An isolated country loses time, knowledge, and strategic freedom. This brings us back to the burning harbor where our story began. Let us return once more to Darwin on February 19, 1942. Japanese aircraft filled the sky above northern Australia. Ships burned inside the harbor while smoke covered the city. On the ground, people rescued casualties and repaired damaged facilities. Military personnel prepared for further attacks. In this dramatic scene, submarine cables were almost impossible to notice. They did not shoot down Japanese aircraft. They did not sink enemy warships. They did not single-handedly save Australia from invasion. Their importance was quieter and more fundamental. The wider communications network kept Australia connected with its allies. It allowed governments to exchange information and make coordinated decisions. It connected strategic planning with ships, aircraft, supplies, and soldiers. The cable was not a miraculous weapon. It was one essential part of a much larger system. That system helped prevent Australia from becoming completely isolated. From the telegraph cables of 1871 to wartime military communications, and from wartime communications to today's global internet, the technology changed, but its strategic meaning remained. Modern civilization is connected by more than roads, ports, and railways. It is also connected by hidden lines crossing the ocean floor. When people remember war, they usually remember visible weapons. They remember aircraft, tanks, warships, and artillery. But history is also shaped by quieter forces. A signal delivered at the correct moment. An order reaching the correct commander. A network continuing to operate during disaster, and a cable lying silently beneath the sea.